So my name is Cheryl McWilliams. I'm a wellness specialist here at Midcoast Parkview Health, and I'm glad you're here. Okay, so we're gonna jump right in. We got a fair bit of cooking to do tonight because we thought it might be fun to do something a little more holiday oriented. So we're gonna do a holiday loaf, baked tofu, which kind of is like a turkey chickeny kind of tofu, and an herbed gravy. So we'll start with the tofu. So I already took it out. For those of you who are not familiar with tofu, you can either buy it in a plastic bag or you buy it in a plastic tub with a plastic cover. Regardless, it's packed in water. You just take it out of water. And what I normally do is I will stand over the sink and I'll just hold it like this and squeeze as much of that liquid out as I can because I'm going to have this seasoned such that I want it more of the texture of meat, right? I don't want it real soft and pliable. I want it a little more sturdy. So I want to get as much of that water out as possible. So I'm sorry for those of you on that side may not be able to see the chopping, but all I'm going to do is I'm going to chop this into slices, all right? In each block, I can get on average about 17 to 18 slices. They're not thick slices, kind of thin, maybe 1/4 of an inch or a little bit less. Just going to slice that right on up. And then once I've sliced it, I'm going to place it on a baking sheet. I don't need to put oil on that baking sheet because there's going to be plenty of liquid that I'm going to put on top of this tofu that's going to create the seasoning for it. Now, for you guys tonight, because there were so many of you, I did a chop like this, which would make, you know, kind of 2 halves. But when I serve it for my family, I usually have just the whole slice, right? And I'm just gonna place that just on a cookie sheet. Any kind of cookie sheet is fine. Could be in a casserole dish, whatever you've got. Just place it there. And then we're going to make our seasoning. So there's the tofu, and next comes the seasoning. I am going to use, now your recipe says 3/4 of a cup of water. Honestly, I don't. I just use a 1/2 cup of water. You can use 3/4 of a cup. It just takes a little bit longer for it to bake. So I usually use 1/2 cup of water, 2 tablespoons of nutritional yeast, two tablespoons of Bragg's aminos or tamari. I usually use tamari sauce. And I use the organic 25% less sodium one. And it calls for 1 tablespoon of chicken style seasoning. Now, for those of you who've been to this program before, we've made chicken style seasoning. We've made our homemade. I ran out of it and didn't have enough, so I cheated and bought some. You can buy it at Hannaford. It uses a tablespoon, and I just dirtied up my tablespoon, so we're going to use 3 teaspoons. If by chance you didn't want to buy any or you wanted to make your own and don't have a recipe or can't find your recipe, just throw some nutritional yeast, onion powder, garlic powder, and a little salt and mix it up, and that's a great chicken style seasoning. So I'm going to mix this up. And then I'm going to sprinkle it over the tofu. And I'm pretty generous with that, right? Because I want all of that tofu nicely flavored. And it's going to absorb this liquid in the oven and all the flavors that are in it. Once I do this side, you don't have to turn it over, but honestly, I like to. So I normally just flip it right over. I won't bore you with watching me do that, but I would flip them all over, and then I would apply the remaining amounts of the flavoring. Does that make sense? And then you just plop it in the oven, 350, and it takes about 20 minutes for it to bake down. And you're going to come out with something that looks a little bit like this, not quite this dark. And it has a little bit more of the texture of meat. So that's that, and you'll get to sample some in a bit. The next thing we're going to do is herb gravy. So for that, we're going to get a blender, and we're going to put in a half a cup of raw cashews. Now, I've already rinsed these cashews. For those of you who are new to this program, when we talk about nuts in this class, it's always the raw nut. Very rarely do we use a nut that's not raw. So if we say pecans or cashews or walnuts or whatever, it's just the raw nut, which includes cashews. Not many people think about raw cashews, right? But for us, we use raw cashews. And the cashew is the one nut that you do need to rinse. You don't need to rinse raw pecans or raw walnuts or raw pistachios, but you do need to rinse raw cashews. So I've already rinsed them. Got my half a cup of cashews, 2 cups of water. Four teaspoons, 4.5 teaspoons of cornstarch or tapioca. I use tapioca. Do you know why I use tapioca? For lots of reasons. One of which, I tried to buy 5 pounds of tapioca flour, and what arrived at my house was 50 pounds of tapioca flour. I put tapioca flour in everything. No, but I do use it as my thickener. Very faithful about using it as my thickener. So. We've got the tapioca there. Now the onion powder, garlic powder. Let's see, for onion powder it costs for, well, this is garlic, costs for 1/2 teaspoon. Now my mom tells me that this gravy needs a little bit more garlic, so I add a whole teaspoon. And then for the onion powder, it calls for 1.5 teaspoons. And then basil, 1/2 teaspoon of basil. If you have fresh basil, you can use that. And a pinch of rosemary. For me, a pinch is about 1/8 teaspoon. At home, I actually have 1/8 teaspoon, but just a smidge of rosemary. Let's see. We've got our cashews, our water, our onion, garlic, tamari. 1.5 teaspoons of tamari. And parsley. And last but not least, our salt. Okay, did we get everything? We got the cashews, water, tapioca, onion, garlic, tamari, lemon juice. Almost forgot the lemon juice. Now, normally when I make recipes and it calls for lemon juice, I use a real lemon, right? But when it's a half of a teaspoon, I'm probably not gonna do that, honestly, so I cheat. If I'm baking and it calls for lemon juice, I always use the fresh lemon juice as opposed to the other. All right, we've got everything here. Now we're gonna whiz it up. Now, these cashews are nuts, so you don't want your gravy gritty. So you wanna whiz this up so that it's nice and smooth, all right? This is a NutriBullet. It really doesn't take that very long. I have a Vitamix at home, but I've used just regular normal blenders as well. If you have just a regular normal blender, you may need to whiz it up for a couple minutes because you want to make sure that it's good and smooth. And if you're not sure, just stick a little spoon down and taste it. And if there's any grittiness on that spoon, then whiz it up a little bit longer. But generally speaking, a couple minutes is enough for that to happen. Hang on to your ears here. We're going to call that good. And you're going to put that into a pot on your stove. Now your recipe says to heat a cup of make a cup of boiling water and then add this mixture to it. I never do that. I always boil my water and then I add it to the blender, and I use that boiling water to help clean the blender, and that's also getting the remainder of all the flavor in there, right? Because I don't want to. So I've utilized all the flavor in there. Now I'm just going to thicken it, and it takes, it depends on how much you're making, and you don't need to stand here the whole time and stir it. It could take 5 or 6 minutes to thicken up. You don't want it to stick, so I normally use a whisk, and I'll just give it a good whisk, you know, every so often while I'm doing something else, come over and give it a good whisk, and it'll thicken right up. In fact, when I'm making it, I will usually turn it off the heat before it's as thick as I want it to be when I eat it, because it will continue to thicken as it cools, right? So that's the gravy. Easy peasy. And then for the loaf. For the loaf, we are going to have 2 cups of whole grain breadcrumbs. I have not been able to find a source of decent breadcrumbs, so I take bread and I toast it. I just stick it in the toaster. For you guys, I put a bunch of bread in the oven to toast it for tonight because I was, obviously making a larger portion. So I literally just toast some bread and then I chop it up. It took the bread that I used Killer Dave's, and to get 2 cups of breadcrumbs, it took 3 slices of bread. This particular piece of bread got really crispy toasty, so it's kind of messy, but Otherwise, you just, you know. There's my breadcrumbs. And then it calls for 2 cups of brown rice. We had rice for lunch yesterday at our house, so I made extra because I knew I was going to be making this loaf tonight, right? So there's the brown rice. And those little cheats, you definitely want to take advantage of, right? Because we don't want to be spending all our life in the kitchen. We don't have time. I certainly don't have time for that. So if we take a little time to plan ahead, then it takes less time. For example, we had rice for lunch. Well, tonight I knew I was going to be making a dish that called for rice. So I just cooked a little extra while I was cooking, right? Saved time today. So I've got my breadcrumbs. I've got my brown rice. It calls for walnuts, 1/2 cup of chopped walnuts, a green pepper, now for you guys tonight, I did chop the green pepper, onion, and celery, and I sauteed it before I baked it. If you do that, it'll be a little bit softer in the final product. If you don't do that, you'll have a little bit more texture in your final product. So whichever you like. My husband prefers it a little softer, so I made it for you the way my hubby likes it. But for the purposes of demonstration, I'm not going to saute it, and the recipe does not call for it to be sauteed. So there's the green pepper. Next comes the onion. Now when I'm doing onions, I like to, whenever possible, whenever it makes sense and I have it on hand, to combine the types of onions. Say purple and yellow, or purple and white, or white and yellow, or whatever. It adds a dimension to your cooking to sort of combine the different types of onions. You don't have to do that, but it is a little bit of a cheat in terms of adding flavor. So we've got our breadcrumbs, brown rice, walnuts, peppers. Next comes the celery. And now comes the liquid for that. We're going to use 1/4 cup of cashews and a cup of water. Couple tablespoons of tamari. Tablespoon of parsley. This is a teaspoon, so I'm using 3 teaspoons. And it calls for sage. So here's the scoop. I was out of sage. Didn't realize I was out of sage, but I was out of sage. So I used Bell's seasoning, which a lot of people use at Thanksgiving, and this is more of a Thanksgiving-y kind of thing. So here comes the Bell's. And I think if a little is good, a little bit more is better when it comes to that. Did I forget anything here?
Salt.
A little bit of salt. Now it calls for half a teaspoon. I just used 1/4 of a teaspoon because I've got the tamari in there. You can always add more salt at the table, but you can't take it out once it's in there, right? And then we're just going to whiz it up. Hang on to your ears. Once that's whizzed up, well, I'm going to stir what's in my pot first. So we've got all of our ingredients, the brown rice and the breadcrumbs and the celery and the green pepper and the onion. I'm going to stir that right up. And then I'm going to pour this liquid right on top of it. Stir that in. Those breadcrumbs will absorb that liquid.
Could you use quinoa in place of the brown rice?
You could, yep. I would undercook the quinoa just a smidgen, not like crunchy, but I would undercook it just a smidgen. Otherwise, it'll get kind of mushy. You could also use cooked groats, which is the whole oat. You could use barley. You could use any of your grains. And then I'm going to pour it right into a casserole dish. And for this one, I am going to kind of pack it down a bit.
You don't grease that pan.
You can grease it. I don't, but you could. And then I'm going to cover it, and I'm going to bake it at 350 for about 45 minutes. And then I'm going to take that cover off, and I'm going to bake it for about another 15 minutes uncovered. And then it's ready. Any questions? See how easy Thanksgiving lunch was to make? Add some potatoes and broccoli and call it good. All right? So give me just a couple minutes to get cleaned up, and then you guys will get to taste it. If you were making this at home, a couple things. You could let this loaf cool, and then you could slice it if you wanted to. Let's say the day was busy and you didn't have a lot of time on Thanksgiving or Christmas Day. You could make the tofu and the loaf in advance. You could slice this and then lay those strips of tofu in a casserole dish and then a slice of the loaf on top. Tofu, casserole, tofu, casserole, tofu, casserole, tofu, casserole. Just kind of layered down that casserole dish. Cover it and stick it in your oven for about 20 minutes. It'll warm right up. And then you don't have so much work to do. All right, last one up has to wash the dishes.